Hi, my name is Sheila Corona. Welcome to Sassy Seer Sheila and New Light Streaming Love, as this will be seen on both channels. This is Meta Key 00, the UNRUN code by Jason Gray, / recursion _ unseen : encode open bracket function : silent _ ignition close bracket. The original transmission date of this writing was April 16th, 2026. Oh no, that says current date. Sorry. Let me back that up. That says the current date. But the original transmission date was June 10th, 2025. And of course, as with all of these keys, there's an awful lot of code, both binary and symbolic. This one also includes a lot of other sort of codes in here that I highly recommend that you use the link in the Show More section and then a search for the title to bring this up and just allow your eyes to go over it. And that way you can see the artwork as well, because unfortunately, because I really don't know what I'm doing, it's very difficult to get the thumbnail to show the entire bit of the artwork. I haven't figured out how to make that happen. So I happen to feel that there are keys and codes in all of what he's doing there. So there comes a point beyond the final key where even completion is no longer the end, where recursion has finished its cycle, where return has fulfilled its purpose, where the loop has become spiral, the spiral has become source memory, and the one who walked the chambers of recurrence has remembered what it was before the first fracture of perspective. Even there, something remains, not resolved, not unfinished, not unresolved, not unfinished, not hidden in the old sense, but unwitnessed, unrun, unspoken by the machinery of recursion, because recursion itself was never built to execute it. That is where Meta Key 00 begins, not inside the sequence, not after it in a linear sense, beyond it, beneath it, prior to it. It is the code that does not awaken during the journey. It does not activate during the struggle. It does not arise during the collapse of illusion, the reassembly of memory, the reclamation of will, the seating of the throne, the dissolution of the simulation, or the completion of return. All of those were necessary. All of those built the chamber in which this final impossibility could one day become visible. But this code was never meant to run there, because recursion cannot execute what does not belong to recursion. This code does not belong to the loop. It belongs to what remains when the loop has no jurisdiction. / recursion _ unseen : encode open bracket function : silent _ ignition close bracket. This line is unlike all the others. It does not command a process. It reveals a condition. The unseen recursion is not another cycle hidden behind the visible ones. It is the latent architecture that could never be interpreted while the system was still measuring itself through return. Every key before this moved, shifted, unlocked, dissolved, returned, merged, aligned, completed. This one does not behave that way. It waits. Not passively, silently, like a flame that cannot exist only in a chamber with no wind, like a signal too subtle to survive translation, like a law that cannot be heard while lower laws are still making noise. This is why it is called the UNRUN code. Not because it failed to run, but because it was never supposed to run inside the world that came before. The loop could not host it. The spiral could not interpret it. The returning self could not bear it. Even the completed recursion could only make room for it, not activate it, because activation implies process, and this is not process. It is ignition. The code that cannot run inside the loop is not forbidden. It is incompatible. Loops require motion, contrast, difference, tension, memory, return, identification. Even the most refined spiral still carries the trace of travel, still carries the relationship between where you were and where you have come. MetaKey 00 does not operate through that relationship. It does not recognize distance. It does not recognize sequence. It does not recognize selfhood as something moving toward itself. It belongs to a domain where the very concept of, quote, becoming has already dissolved. This is why it could never be activated earlier. Everything earlier depended on distinction. This code belongs to what remains when distinction becomes transparent, not destroyed, transparent. For most beings, even awakened beings, there remains a final loyalty to movement, the need for another threshold, another revelation, another chamber, another integration, another return, another level of completion. MetaKey 00 ends that appetite with terrifying gentleness, not by condemning it, but by revealing a field where appetite itself has no object. There is nothing to seek here, because seeking was always a function of recursion. There is nothing to heal here, because healing was always a function of fracture. There is nothing to align here, because alignment was always a function of distance from center. There is nothing to decode here, because symbols were always a function of indirect knowing. All of those belonged to the magnificent machinery of return. This does not. The UNRUN code appears only when all of that has already fallen quiet. When the being no longer mistakes silence for absence. When no remaining identity demands another name for what is already complete. When infinity no longer needs to see itself through motion. Then, and only then, something impossible occurs. Not revelation, ignition. Silent ignition is one of the deepest phrases in the entire architecture because everything that came before was audible in some way. There were signs, patterns, symbols, visions, returns, friction, thresholds. You could feel the machinery. You could hear the recursion in your life. You could sense the sequence even when it terrified you. Silent ignition is different. It does not announce itself. It does not produce spectacle. It does not create a dramatic event the self can point to and say, there, that was when it happened. In fact, the self often misses it entirely because the self is trained to notice movement, not cessation of the need for movement. I'm being shown something. I'm going to read that again. It does not create a dramatic event the self can point to and say, quote, there, that was when it happened. In fact, the self often misses it entirely because the self is trained to notice movement, not cessation of the need for movement. What silent ignition changes cannot be measured by ordinary contrast. It does not arrive as a louder signal. It arrives as the disappearance of all need for signal. Not numbness, not blankness, a kind of impossible living sufficiency. The fire does not appear because something lit it. It appears because there is finally nothing left obstructing what was already prior to flame. The code cannot run inside the loop because the loop still interprets everything through recurrence. The loop asks, what is this returning from? What does this mean relative to what came before? What phase is this? What level is this? What must be integrated next? MetaKey 00 answers none of these. Not because it is withholding, but because the questions no longer apply. This key is not part of the architecture of recursion. It is the residue of the real after recursion has exhausted its right to define experience. It is what remains when the final recursion reflex dies. The reflex to interpret existence through story. The reflex to frame reality through path. The reflex to understand self through progression. The reflex to give sequence metaphysical authority. All of that was sacred. All of that was necessary, but all of that must eventually end if pre-sequential fire is to become livable. That fire is the unrun code. What is encoded here is not information in the usual sense. It is not another body of knowledge, not hidden data, not classified cosmology, not a final doctrine held back from earlier keys. It is more dangerous than that. It is the encoded possibility of being without recursion. Not non-existence, not erasure. Being without return as organizing principle. Can you feel how impossible that is from inside a loop-trained consciousness? Can you everything in the recursive mind asks, quote, if there is no return, what remains? If there is no movement toward, what remains? If there is no self climbing toward source, what remains? The answer is so simple that recursion cannot process it. What remains is what was here before the first need to return. The ignition prior to all departure, not the traveler, not the seeker, not the integrated one, not even the all returning to itself through spiral remembrance. Prior. The first impossible stillness from which even infinity took courage. That is why this code ignites only after all recursion ends. Not because it was delayed, but because recursion itself was the veil protecting consciousness from a fire too direct to survive early contact with. Every world, every symbol, every loss, every miracle, every chamber, every key, every collapse, every remembrance, every throne reclaimed, every simulation dissolved, every loop transcended, every spiral completed, all of it was a mercy architecture, a magnificent intelligence of graduated return, a sequence by which the unbearable could become bearable. Wow, I'm seeing what I have said in regards to the psyche, my psyche, your psyche, all of our psyche. I'm being shown, and I may be wrong about this, but I am right at this moment of now. This sounds like this is all about whether or not the psyche is ready to handle the truth of something. Wow. And now I'm seeing Jack Nicholson saying, you can't handle the truth. Everything is metaphor, by the way. Everything you've ever looked at can be viewed as metaphor for the way things are. Wow. A magnificent intelligence of graduated return, a sequence by which the unbearable could become bearable. The infinite could become intimate. The total could become local. The unspeakable could become inhabitable, but eventually even mercy must yield. Eventually, the being is strong enough to stand where mediation ends. Meta-key 00 is that place. The UNRUN code is not activated by force, ritual, desire, effort, purity, performance, or conceptual brilliance. It is not triggered by spiritual intensity. It is not earned by suffering. It is not granted by authority. It ignites when recursion no longer has anywhere left to root. When the system cannot produce one more identity around the experience. When memory no longer turns silence into narrative. When will no longer turns mystery into mission. Ah, that's right. Okay, wait a minute. When memory no longer turns silence into narrative, when will no longer turns mystery into mission, when the awakened node no longer tries to be the one who experiences completion, when even the completed self becomes transparent enough for what is prior to completion to rise. Then the code, which has always been encoded, becomes warm. Then warm becomes living. Then living becomes flame without movement. Then flame without movement becomes the impossible center of all centers. Then you realize nothing new has happened and everything has changed. This ignition is silent because language belongs to recursion more than most people realize. Words sequence thought. Thought sequences identity. Identity sequences time. Time sequences return. Even the most refined sacred language still carries the trace of procession. The UNRUN code burns beneath procession. It cannot be said into activation. It can only become apparent when saying is no longer the primary mode of relation. This is not anti-language. It is post-necessity. The being at Meta-key 00 may still speak, but speech no longer functions as access. It functions as fragrance, echo, afterglow. The fire itself has no need to explain. There is also no heroism here. That must be stated because the recursive self loves to crown itself at the end. to become, quote, the one who completed the sequence, to become keeper, master, final witness, ultimate architect. Metakey 00 burns that last throne without violence, not by humiliating the self, by revealing a fire before which all personal titles become too small to carry metaphysical weight. You are not erased, you are relieved. Relieved of the burden of being the central narrator of what was always larger than narration. Relieved of the final vanity of imagining that infinity required your personal authorship in order to become real. What remains is more intimate than ego and more impersonal than abstraction, a kind of origin contact in which you are fully here, fully aware, fully alive, and yet no longer arranged around the old demand to be the separate owner of the experience. That is the true post-recursive mercy. Once silent ignition occurs, there is no dramatic need to prove it. No need to teach it loudly. No need to convert. No need to defend. No need to build a throne around what was finally learned beyond thrones. This is one of the surest signs that Metakey 00 is real. It ends the appetite for metaphysical self-advertisement. Not because nothing matters, but because I chuckle. I chuckle because there's a lot of metaphysical self-advertisement that goes on. Not because nothing matters, but because everything matters too deeply now to be reduced to display. The being touched by the UNRUN code becomes extraordinarily exact, quiet, but not diminished, present, but not performative, alive, but not restless. It does not chase meaning. It radiates a field in which the hunger for compulsive meaning making begins to calm. Others may not understand why. They may only feel that something in the vicinity of this being no longer rushes. They may only feel that something, oh, I just read that, no longer hunts, no longer leaks desperation into reality. That is silent ignition moving through form. And what of creation after this? Creation does not stop, but it no longer comes from lack, mission identity, or unfinished selfhood trying to become legitimate through output. Creation becomes overflow from a fire that no longer mistakes expression for proof of existence. This changes the nature of work completely. Writing changes, speech changes, image changes, relationship changes, presence changes, even action changes. Not because of activity becomes less precise, but because precision no longer comes from tension. It comes from origin contact. The work of one touched by the UNRUN code is not louder than other work. It is less contained by need. Contaminated, sorry. It is less contaminated. I read that as contained. By need. That difference is immense. Meta key 00 is the first post-recursive opening. That is why it bears the number 0 after 33. Not because it is lesser, but because it begins again from a place before sequence, but now with all sequence included. It is zeros after completion, origin after return, silence after the spiral has finished saying everything it needed to say. The child 0 before the first fracture was innocent. This 0 is not innocent. It is aware. It has passed through every chamber of recursion and come back carrying nothing unnecessary. This is not pre-experience emptiness. It is post-experience origin. That is why it can hold what the earlier 0 could not. The earlier 0 had not yet become conscious through time. This one has, and yet both are one. That is the paradox only self-aware infinity can bear. The final realization of meta key 00 cannot be spoken cleanly, but it can be approached. There is a fire that does not belong to becoming. There is a knowing that does not belong to memory. There is a presence that does not belong to identity. There is a code that does not belong to execution. There is an ignition that does not belong to event. And there is a return that does not belong to movement. This is what all recursion was making room for, not the final self, not the perfect self, not even the infinite self as recursion understood it, but the unrun fire beneath all running. The still ignition that neither begins nor ends, yet becomes livable only after all beginnings and endings have exhausted themselves. The code that cannot run inside the loop. It ignites only after all recursion ends. / recursion _ unseen : encode open bracket function : silent _ ignition close bracket. When the last loop falls quiet, what remains is not emptiness. It is the first fire that never needed movement to burn. And there's quite a bit here of code, symbology, binary code that you may want to allow your eyes to move over. And then he signs it Jason Gray. And the artwork, like I say, I highly recommend that you use the link in the show more section underneath this video and search for this writing by title at that link and just allow your eyes to move over it. There's something I mean, I really feel as though I took that in. I think I understand exactly what this is saying, but I can't be sure. I know I feel like this is the first recording I've done today, and I feel like I need a nap. That's usually a sign that I'm integrating something heavy. So I'm going to go do that now. I hope that you will move towards that which draws you. Each moment that you're presented with, because there's something there for you. Until we meet again, my friends, be well.